Each has won a glorious grave, not that sepulchre of earth wherein they lie, but the living tomb of everlasting remembrance wherein their glory is enshrined. For the whole earth is the sepulchre of heroes. Monuments may rise, and tablets be set up to them in their own land, but on far-off shores there is an abiding memorial that no pen or chisel has traced. It is graven not on stone or brass, but on the living hearts of humanity. Take these men for your example. Like them, remember that prosperity can be only for the free, that freedom is the sure possession of those alone who have the courage to defend it. These are the immortal words engraved at Anzac Cove, written over 2,000 years ago by the Athenian statesman and politician Pericles. These words speak of the glory and honor that soldiers have won in battle through fantastic deeds and great acts of heroism. But as those who have ever seen a documentary or heard any story from World War I, these stories are not to be romanticized and mistaken for some fairy tale that we trot out once a year on Remembrance Day. And so we get to the film I want to talk about today. And for those who have seen my previous videos will note that I generally like to keep things fairly lighthearted and somewhat humorous. But my love for history, and especially the serious nature of the First World War, I'll be aiming to keep things mostly on the straight and narrow. Mostly. All Quiet on the Western Front is a cinematic masterpiece with absolutely gut-wrenching battle sequences, characters that have a heart-rending journey through the horrors of the First World War, and watching it in its original German translation, I believe, is the best way to watch it. I was looking forward to this movie when I first saw the trailer, and so I had a very high expectation, as we don't really get to see many World War I movies, because World War II movies are much more easy to market. So, to explain what I liked about this movie and why it really hit that sweet spot for me, allow me to give you a bit of a brief history lesson to give you some context, as the movie is set in 1917, which is 3 years into the war, and it's kind of important to know, at least I find, to know what happened in the war prior to this. And I'm sure when you hear World War I, you think super grainy footage that's in black and white, so in order to keep this video a little bit more stimulating, I'll attempt to use more coloured footage, because I love seeing old footage in colour. World War I was fought from the years 1914 to 1918, and was fought between the two power axes of the day. With the fighting mainly happening in Europe, the most prominent nations involved was between Great Britain, France and Russia, and eventually the United States on one side of the powers, with the opposing forces consisting of the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. World War I was the greatest and most terrible show of power history had ever seen at that point, that left an estimated 9 million soldiers being killed in combat, plus another 23 million wounded, while 5 million civilians died as a result of military action, hunger and disease. What began the war is a topic of much debate, with the actual instigator being the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian extremist on the 14th of November.
I heard that it started when a bloke called Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry.
I think you mean it started when the Archduke of Austro-Hungary got shot.
No, there was definitely an ostrich involved.
But there had been many events prior to this that made this the straw that broke the camel's back, with the other things being the empire building of the late 19th century, the arms race and rising tensions in the Balkans.
The war started because of the vile Hun and his villainous empire building.
George, the British Empire at present covers a quarter of the globe, while the German Empire consists of a small sausage factory in Tanganyika. I hardly think that we can be entirely absolved from blame on the imperialistic front. But the real reason for the whole thing was that it was just too much effort not to have a war.
Now, all these causes thrown into the mixer were, of course, a recipe for disaster, but there simply is no better way to sum up the cause of the war than in one final clip of the wise words of Edmund Blackadder.
You see, Baltic, in order to prevent war in Europe, two superblocks developed. Us, the French and the Russians on one side, and the Germans and Austro-Hungary on the other. The idea was to have two vast opposing armies, each acting as the other's deterrent. That way, there could never be a war. That's right, you see, there was a tiny flaw in the plan.
What was that, Tom?
It was bollocks.
Now with that out of the way, time to move on to the novel and the film. All Quiet on the Western Front is based on the 1929 novel of the same name, although it is German and its better translation is Nothing New in the West. Written by World War I veteran Erich Maria Remarque, and I'm sure I butchered that name, so I'm sorry. The novel is about Erich's experience in the trenches in the years of the First World War, and his fellow brothers in arms as they dealt with the trauma of war and returning to civilian life. The themes portrayed in the novel are of disillusionment, camaraderie, and the things that keep these men going when it seems that all the world is falling down around them. The main character, Paul Bäumer, is the focus of the story and follow his perspectives, and never having read the novel, I'll stick mainly to the film and the historicity of the movie. Now, from my research, I would say that the film is more historically authentic rather than historically accurate, although it doesn't exactly get anything wrong either. Now, I know that probably sounds confusing, so I'll go into a brief summary of what I mean. Germany, from what I can tell, was mainly on the defensive in World War I, so their trenches were usually much better built than the Allied forces, except for a brief moment in 1918 when they went on the offensive after Russia pulled out of the war, and the fact that they built their trenches first, it meant that they had better soil to dig in and had a much higher ground. Their trenches were built with concrete and had these deep dugouts that the German soldiers were able to disappear into when Allied forces would shell them, and then as soon as the shelling would end, they would crawl back out and immediately open fire on the advancing Allied armies. This is shown quite well in the movie at the beginning, when Paul and his comrades have first arrived at the front lines of the Western Front, when they hide in their dugouts and normally would be able to withstand the shelling, but the Allied forces are able to pinpoint Paul's dugout, and so they are able to destroy it effectively, with Paul losing the first of many friends to the war. This brings up another key point of the movie, and something that all soldiers dealt with in the First World War, was the loss of friends and the constant barragement of enemy gunfire. Like most soldiers who went off to war, Paul had listened to all the great orators giving their moving speeches, and had joined the war to go on the adventure of a lifetime with his friends and return home a hero. The reality of war quickly setting in as men started dying left, right, and centre, and with the relentless hail of cannon fire and gunfire wasn't causing men to lose their minds and lose all hope, boredom would quickly set in and would be even more taxing on the men's minds. The movie shows Paul and his comrades trying to deal with the monotony of being away from home and in a war when combat wasn't happening. A scene in the movie which is quite touching is when it shows the soldiers taking comfort in the small things, and shows Paul and some of his comrades stealing a goose from a farmer, and the men then share a poignant meal together, and we see the small things, taken for granted by most people, were treasured above all else to these men. Scenes like this gave the movie so much emotion and heart, that even though it may be difficult to remember all the soldiers' names, because there's quite a few of them, you care deeply about all of them, and you don't want any of them to perish, and when you do see them die, it just hurts all the more. Now, World War I was vastly different to its successor, as World War II had a clearly defined antagonist in Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. World War I was a monstrous war that should never have been fought in the first place, as there was no clear-cut goal. There's no vindictive tyrant that needed to be overthrown, no enslaved people that needed to be liberated, no toxic, poisonous ideology that needed to be combated. World War I was a meat grinder that millions of young men were tossed into, and the movie shows the futility of the mindsets of military high command at the time, with the peace talks happening between France and Germany being a dual timeline that runs parallel to Paul's story. The movie does make a very conscious effort not to demonize any one side, showing that both sides had innocent young men who just wanted to go home, and commanders who were stuck in the old ways of thinking, with the empire building a misguided honor above all things, and that to die for your country was the greatest thing you could do in your life. As the peace talks conclude with the humiliating armistice of the 11th of November 1918, that basically crippled Germany indefinitely, German High Command's desire to stick it to the French one last time, and put them in better standing for the peace talks, make one last futile push to move the stalemate that had existed since 1915. Now, no major battle is named in the film, which kind of gives it this sort of purgatory feel of no beginning or end to the conflict, just endless fighting and death, but something similar did actually happen to this. On the 3rd of March, Russia had suffered a defeat at home, with the February Revolution that had seen Tsar Nicholas II be overthrown and his entire family murdered, which meant that Russia could no longer hold the Eastern Front. This allowed Germany to free up over 50 divisions that they promptly sent to the Western Front. Germany knew that it would never win the war once American troops started landing in Europe, and so on the 21st of March 1918, Germany promptly instigated the Ludendorff Offensive, which was intended to break through the Allied lines outflank the British forces, and defeat the British army. The resulting defeat would then force the French armies to capitulate and seek an armistice, and end the war in Germany's favour. However, the constant changing of targets, the struggle to maintain resources being sent to the ever-moving front line, and the simple lack of momentum meant that Germany couldn't punch through the Allied lines, and while they did take back the ground that they had lost in 1916 and 1917, the arrival of American troops forced Germany back in the 100 Days Offensive, which pushed Germany all the way back and eventually forced them to capitulate. What we see in the movie, however, is more like German high command's stubbornness, where a general is unhappy with the peace talks and believes that he is a soldier first and foremost, and that is simply all he knows. So he commands Paul and the remaining contingent of men to make one last final push to take back land that had been lost, even though at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, the war will be over and all hostilities will cease. Paul, who at this point has watched all of his friends perish, has lost any desire to survive, and so charges headlong into battle and kills multiple soldiers before finally perishing himself. As he is stabbed through the back by a bayonet, he stumbles out into the daylight, just as the whistles blow that signify the war is over, and the fighting all around him ceases. It's a truly outstanding scene that really pushes its anti-war message without clubbing you over the head with the point it's trying to make. We see how pointless the war was and how so much of it could have been avoided, and we even see the groundwork that would eventually lead to the inescapable World War II. With France treating Germany with no decency in defeat, it was only inevitable that Germany would strike back with a vengeance. Several historians agree that the Treaty of Versailles was one of the major causes of World War II, as it forced Germany to take the blame for the war starting, and made them accept responsibility for all the life lost and all the damage caused, which forced Germany to make enormous financial reparations, which in today's money cost a total of 442 billion US dollars, or 284 billion pounds. Not only that, but they could no longer have any real standing army, and would have to give away large chunks of their empire, until they were basically just a small state with no power. This left no one satisfied, as the Germans weren't properly crippled, so the French weren't happy, and Germany was humiliated and basically almost destroyed, with its economy completely in tatters, and its people totally reliant on American loans to pay off their financial debts. These talks are somewhat shown in the movie, and you see how it burns every German who was forced to sign it, and how angry and vindictive the French high command was. The German diplomat wants a peace that will satisfy both parties, whereas most of the generals don't want peace, and the French offer almost no quarter. And I feel like it somewhat demonizes the French, but you can also kind of understand why there is such bitterness from the French high command. All while this is happening, Paul and his friends are in the trenches fighting the real fight and holding on for their very lives. The juxtaposition of these storylines is shown brilliantly, and really emphasizes the futility of the war. The movie is shot very well, and I may be wrong about this, but I think the movie was made on about a budget of $800,000, which is staggeringly cheap for a war movie. Now, to give you a comparison, Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk from 2017 had a budget of between $100 million and $150 million, and Sam Mendes' 1917 had a budget of between $90 million and $100 million. So having less than $1 million to make a serious war film is nothing short of miraculous, and yet the movie looks amazing. It's shot well, and although a lot of the scenes may not be as grandiose as other war films, this movie still looks fantastic. This isn't the first adaptation of the novel, as there was a 1930 film adaptation of the book, as well as a 1979 television series. But this is the first time it's been done with the benefit of modern CGI and modern practical effects, and it really shows. The battle scenes feel brutal. The acting is quite well done, especially seeing as most actors aren't big names or anything, and the movie doesn't rely on star power. A similar thing was done in Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk, where he specifically wanted a no-name actor to portray the main character, as the men at the Battle of Dunkirk weren't battle-hardened veterans, and a similar thing here. Paul and all his friends are fresh recruits, with most of the battle-hardened veterans all having perished by this point. Now, the actors work quite well off each other, and their performance, while not exemplary, is still quite convincing, especially with one scene where Paul kills his first soldier in hand-to-hand combat. At first he is full of adrenaline, and is only thinking of survival, But as soon as the adrenaline wears off and the French soldier starts choking on his own blood and takes several minutes to die, Paul is gripped with the consequences of what he's done. He begins to panic. Then he tries to help the man by giving him water and trying to bandage his wounds, all the while professing how sorry he is. The scene is just brutal and works so well to show that neither men were power-hungry fanatics. They were just both trying to survive. This movie isn't for the faint of heart, but I still believe it is an important movie, and I am so happy Netflix did it right, because Netflix are kind of known for screwing up things based on their source material. Cowboy Bebop. I thought this movie was excellent, and I made sure to watch it in its original German translation, and I would recommend you, dear viewer, to do the same. It does mean you have to watch it with subtitles and focus on what they're saying, but it makes for a much more interesting watch, trust me. Movies like this, to me, are incredibly important, as I remember people from my history class when I was in grade 10 who didn't even know there was a world war in the first place. And just because it happened over 100 years ago doesn't mean we can forget what happened. Time doesn't mean anything to me, and it doesn't mean anything to those men whose lives were cut short because some higher-up wanted somewhere nicer to stick their drink cabinet. 100 years may have passed, but I still do the Anzac Day Parade every year, because it is important to remember those who have gone before us to give us a better future, and to remember that their sacrifices were not in vain. I'd like to close this review/history lesson with the words of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the first president of the Republic of Turkey, and who was a colonel in World War I, and he fought at Gallipoli, which was a major battle between the combined forces of the Australians and New Zealanders against the Turkish Empire. These words are, quite frankly, some of the most beautiful words a person could ever write, and from a man who did remarkable things for his country. Now, these words were written mainly for the Australians and New Zealanders that died at Gallipoli, but I think they work quite well for all the brave men that fell in the Great War of 1914 to 1918. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now living in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us, where they lie side by side, here in this country of ours. You, the mothers, who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well.